Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the regular meeting of the Stillwater Planning Commission, Tuesday, June 6, 2017. First item for business is land use item for discussion and possible action. Stillwater Medical Center, map amendment, rezoning PZ-17-2189, requesting review and approval of a map amendment to rezone tract of land from O office and RSS residential small lot single family to P public, more particularly addressed as 1411 West 7th, 1404 to 1424 West 8th, 712 to 720 South Stanley, and 707 to 715 South Gray Street, the entire block. Turn over to staff for a presentation.
Good evening, Tom Coots, Development Services. This is an area map of the property. The subject property is highlighted with the black and hatched area from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue between Gray Street and Stanley Street, the entire block. Stillwater Medical Center has purchased the entire property, and so the request is to zone to the public zoning district because the Stillwater Medical Center is a public use. So this is the current, from Google Street View, from the corner of 8th and Stanley, looking to the northwest. There are houses on the property currently. As I said, Stillwater Medical Center has purchased all of the properties. This is looking from 7th and Gray, looking to the southeast. The women's clinic building over here exists there on the north side of the property. So the findings are that the public zoning is used for government-owned properties and uses that benefit the general public, such as the Stillwater Medical Center. The entire block is currently owned by the Stillwater Medical Center which is an authority granted by the City Council. And the use of the property for medical and supporting facilities is in compliance with the C3 comprehensive plan. Do we have any questions for me? Okay.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'll open the public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak in favor of this item, please step forward, state your name and address for the record.
Roger Ghost, 113 East 8th, on behalf of Stillwater Medical Center. Ask for you to support this request. The additional parking's needed because of all the expansion going on right on the campus to their existing building. Like Tom said, all the property is owned by the Stillwater Medical Center. We're proposing approximately 155 parking spaces with entrances on Gray and Stanley, and only two, not just like to limit it to entrances. There's 5 really big, nice trees on there. We're going to try to work around and save those. The drainage will be addressed per the city ordinance and be mitigated, controlled on the site. There'll be new sidewalks constructed completely around the block, basically. And site lighting will be installed to meet city code, minimize any impact on the neighbors. Is there any questions about it? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else who would wish to speak in favor of? Anyone wishing to speak in opposition, please step forward, state your name and address for the record.
Steve Halgren, 910 South Stanley, a couple blocks away. Mike, I'd like to make some comments about the proposal. I'm curious to know how much public input there has been to it, since it's going to change from single-family dwellings to a parking lot. And we've got a lot of parking lots in town, and the last thing the residents around there would like is another Walmart parking lot. It's a heat island, and the effect of that is just to warm the whole neighborhood and increase heating costs. I was glad to see that the city is planning to do something or is requiring that they meet city codes, because we've already got a big drainage problem there. I've lived in that house on Stanley for 26 years, and we get a flood of rainwater running down Stanley, Some of it comes down Gray and then heads south or east on 8th and then down Stanley, and it comes right across 9th Street. And you know exactly where it's coming from. It's the medical center because water doesn't run off of city lots. So I'd like great consideration to be done to that, so that isn't exacerbated, because the next step would probably be to put a sewer drain down Stanley Street, which would be right in front of my house. I'm not real excited about that, considering that the drainage now is already bad enough. Another concern I'd ask, nothing was stated about the traffic patterns that are going to be developed. This will be surrounded by residential. So where are the cars going to come from and exit, and where is the main entrance and exit going to be? We already get a lot of traffic on Stanley because there's only one stop sign between 12th and 7th. And the people that work at the hospital just love to zoom up Stanley. And we've talked to the city about putting another stop sign on Stanley, but there's an idea that that actually tends to speed up traffic rather than slow it down. So where is this traffic going to come from for this 100, where is it going to be? What's the traffic pattern going to be for that lot that's going to be put in there? I'd also like, I didn't hear anything said about trying to make this fit into the residential. It was all about the parking. And I know there was a statement about the preserving the trees, if possible, and then also doing, improving or retaining the water on the site. But also there was no mention of the visual. This is going to change everything. You can see right away when you look at the pictures of it that single-family dwellings produce a very different visual effect than a big parking lot. So you're essentially moving a big parking lot into a residential area. And I think the city or the medical center should really consider what the effect is going to be and maybe how to mitigate it. Fences, hedges, something to block the view of the parking lot. Nobody likes to see an acre of concrete or cement right out their front window. And so those are some of the concerns that I'd like. I'd also be eager to have more input. I've recently learned, although I've lived there for nearly 30 years, that the hospital owns 3 blocks in a row there, intends to take over all of those. And then also all the blocks south of that all the way to Stanley are going to be commercial. And I never heard of this in 30 years of living there. So maybe an effort needs to be done to make this a little bit more well publicized and get public input. In fact, why not have the entire neighborhood look at the plans for the parking lot before it's approved? Something like that. If the medical center wants to be a good neighbor, it's getting bigger and bigger and taking over lots of property, and sooner or later it's going to start running into more resistance. So if they really want to be a good neighbor, I'd suggest they give this more consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You did have a couple questions, which we probably could turn to staff, but does anyone, and is there any others who wish to speak in opposition at this moment? City staff, would you like to answer at least some of those concerns? One with regarding to
The location of the drives, in and out, if you point those out,
things of that sort.
Mr. Goes point, I think I know where they are, but
Or will we see it again, Tom? Maybe is the question.
No, the planning commission would not see the design of the parking lot. That's an administrative level of looking at the developer's engineer, and the developer is here, can probably enlighten us on some of the specific plans and mitigation and detention and those sorts of things. Suffice it to say that stormwater detention is required, just as in any commercial development. And we have suggested that the hospital update their traffic study, because they are doing a lot of work on the campus and around the campus, going to be, and so that was discussed the other day at a meeting with them. So that will be looked at, see if there's anything that's going to be needed, and so we'll probably would be a good idea to include this parking lot and how that may change traffic patterns with that discussion. The parking lot by itself probably doesn't meet the threshold to require a traffic study, but when you consider all the work that's going to be done over the next few years, it would probably be a good idea to look at all that cumulatively. Did I answer any other questions for me?
I have a generalized question. We're asked tonight to zone this public, which means the engineer said that there was a parking lot that goes in this place as a current plan, but 5 years from now, they could build a building on this and it'd still be in the public zoning arena.
Correct.
Is that a correct statement?
Correct.
So we need to think about that as we vote on this.
Correct. Does anyone else wish to speak in opposition? Please step forward. Seeing none. At this time, I will close the public hearing and ask for staff's alternatives.
Okay, we have some alternatives. We can accept the findings and recommend that the City Council approve the proposed map amendment as presented. We could find that the map amendment is not an appropriate use for the property based on impacts to the surrounding vicinity, and to not recommend the City Council approve the map amendment. We can find that additional information or discussion is needed prior to making a recommendation and table the request to a certain date.
Any final questions for staff? All right. Any discussion?
I move we accept findings and recommend the City Council approve the proposed map amendment as presented.
I'll second.
All right. Vote. Motion passes
You'll also want to say 4-0.
4-0. The motion passes 4-0. The next item for business is Trade-in Development LLC preliminary plat PZ-17-2199, requesting review and approval of revised preliminary plat for the Canyons at property addressed as 5788 North Perkins Road to create 162 residential lots and 4 outlots in the RSS Residential Single Family Small Lot Zoning District. Turn off to city staff for presentation.
Tom Coots, Development Services. As I said, we have request for a preliminary plat. It is a slight revision from the old preliminary plat, which we'll discuss. This one has 162 lots. The previous preliminary plat had 147 lots, so there's an increase of 15 lots. The old one was also found to be expired anyway due to the length of time between final plat filings. So the property is highlighted in the purple on the map. It's generally located just to the west of the Canyons development near Burris Road and Perkins Road. This north, it would be to your right on this Burris Road. This is the proposed preliminary plat. It shows a new road access onto Burris Road, so it'll be a second access point for the Canyons north portion, and has several streets. As I said, 162 lots proposed. It's as you'll see, the same basic layout as the previous preliminary plat. Lots are slightly smaller to fit in the extra 15 lots. Then also to meet the International Fire Code, which is now in effect, they've shown a fire access road between this kind of pod back there, and so there's a secondary access point due to the number of houses. And then also I should point out there are 2 cul-de-sacs, this one here, East Coppard Avenue, and this one here, part of Sapphire Court, which are in excess of 500 feet in length. The Land Development Code states that cul-de-sacs should, keyword should, not exceed 500 feet in length. So the Planning Commission has the ability to decide on if this instance is appropriate or not. This is the, to the left side is the old preliminary plat, right side is the new proposed preliminary plat, north is up this time. And you can see that the road layout is the same as before. They just, as I said, made some of the lots smaller so that the additional lots could be fit in. And those cul-de-sacs that I referred to are the same as before. Street view, this is a view down Burris Road. Basically, it's a large open area. This is the end of Topaz. Once again, it's a large open area. So the findings, The proposed preliminary plat is in conformance with the C3 plan, which recommends low-density residential for the area. The proposed preliminary plat is in conformance with all applicable city codes, and the two cul-de-sacs exceed 500 feet in length, as was carried forward from the original preliminary plat. And then this preliminary plat differs from the old one in that it has an increase of 15 lots. Do we have any questions for me?
Now, on the cul-de-sacs, I think I read in the report that I think they're like 550 feet, is that correct?
That'd be somewhere in that area.
Approximately, so
Yeah.
about 50 feet longer
Yeah.
than should be
Right.
constructed. Okay, thank you.
And at that length, I should point out the International Fire Code kicks in, and it'll require a wider street than normal, and the applicant has been made aware of that.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions was, because I couldn't see on the map, are the roads in fact the proper width to take it?
The preliminary plat isn't really a stage to where we would evaluate what they're showing on the roads, is they don't turn in development plans with their improvement plans with this, so that's why we just made them aware of that. That will be a requirement going forward.
How much smaller are the lots now? Did they, like 6 inches smaller on every one of them, or are they?
Might have to ask the applicant
Oh.
how he made that happen.
I just had the one other question is later on our agenda is the thing about the water pressure and things of that sort. I was wondering if would they fall, if we approve now before we do the thing later, these fall previous to that change, or they fall under this change?
The good news is that some of the work on the water pressure has been done by the applicant. He can speak to that. Totally serendipitous to what had happened in Tower Park, because they are already working on the improvement plans, and they've already found that as of right now, when they turn in the improvement plans, they should be okay for the water pressure for this development. As they come in, we'll be evaluating, and that's when we would evaluate it, when they turn in their final plat and improvement plans to whether or not they meet the water pressure required.
Thank you. Okay. I'll now open the public hearing. At this time, anyone wishing to speak in favor of this item, please step forward, state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, Chris Anderson with SMC Consulting Engineers, Oklahoma City. Agree pretty much with everything that Tom said. We've read the staff report, agree with that. As he said, it is basically the same layout that was there before. The streets haven't changed except with the addition of the emergency access road. The lots are a little bit smaller, but they're actually matching what was done in the last phase, phase 4. And we went from, I believe it was 60-foot wide lots to 55-foot wide lots, and that matches what was done in the last final plat stage. So with that, I just appreciate approval of the plat tonight.
Would anyone else wish to speak in favor of? All right. Anyone wishing to speak in opposition, please step forward and state your name and address for the record. There being no one, at this time I'll close the public hearing and ask for staff's alternatives.
Okay, we have some alternatives. We can accept the findings and approve the proposed preliminary plat as presented. We can find that the preliminary plat does not conform to city codes, specify the deficiencies, and table to a certain date to allow for the corrections. We can find that additional information or discussion is needed prior to making a recommendation and table the request to a certain date. However, we must remember that the action must be taken within 60 days of this public hearing. And do you have any questions for me?
Questions for staff? Thank you very much. Discussion.
I move we accept findings and approve the proposed preliminary plat as presented.
Second.
Right. The motion passes 4-0. The next item for business is Plans, Policies, Ordinance for Discussion and Possible Action, Text Amendment, Land Development Code Amendment, PZ-17-2200, requesting review and approval of an amendment to City of Stillwater Code, Chapter 23, Land Development Code, Section 23-.63, Plat subdivision approval process. Hi.
Good evening. Paula Dennison here to present this before you this evening. This is a continuation of discussion that we have had at a couple of our latest Planning Commission meetings where we are addressing plating and, just as Tom alluded to, on the preliminary plat you just reapproved, the expiration in particular of preliminary plat. So a couple of key points. You have the text as proposed in your packets discussing the effective period of a preliminary plat, discussing the final plat compliance with that preliminary plat, the time period for the final plat approval, and then the copies and the number and the format that they are to be provided once the final is filed of record. So, right quickly, as indicated through our discussions, the research from different communities around, and the public input that we had received, we are proposing that preliminary plats have an initial effective period, valid period of 5 years, with the filing of a final plat, whether it's one final plat or all final plats, whatever, within that initial 5-year period, there's an automatic 5-year extension of that preliminary plat, given a total of 10 years. Currently, we have 2, but this would extend that effective validity period for a total of 10 years. In moving to the compliance with the preliminary plat, one of the things that we found that other communities do is if there is a great difference between the final plat that is submitted for approval and the approved preliminary plat, they have a gauge or certain criteria that that final is looked at and evaluated by. Either it requires a new preliminary plat, or it can just be incorporated into the Planning Commission and then the City Council process, instead of having to come back through with the new preliminary. So we have taken a look at that and actually set forth 4 criteria that the final plat, if it exceeds the preliminary plat in these 4 criteria, a new preliminary would have to be refiled. And those are: the street system is not substantially altered. So if you're really not changing the street system, you may adjust it here, you may move a cul-de-sac from one place to another, but you're not adding street lengths, you're not excessively widening, something like that. It would not require a new preliminary. The number of lots is not increased or decreased by more than 5%. That can drastically change the layout and the ability to serve, either increasing or decreasing. The lot layout is not substantially altered, going from rectangle lots to now all of the lots are flagged lots, or they're all circled around a cul-de-sac. That can change the dynamic. And then the common or open space is not decreased by more than 5%. If the final plat doesn't trigger any of these things, then it can proceed. Staff would determine that it is substantially in compliance with the approved preliminary plat, and it would proceed on. If it does trigger any of these, we now have a gauge to say a new preliminary needs to be filed. Okay? And then 2 very brief things lastly. Because we're changing the effective period of a preliminary plat, then we adjusted final plats that the final plat of all or any portion of that preliminary is to be submitted to the Planning Commission and City Council for final approval within 5 years. So that is what can extend the valid period of the preliminary plat, is having 1 or more finals within that initial 5-year period. And then we took this opportunity to look at a couple of technology advances that we are able to provide. And one of those is we're able to do a few more things electronically, not have so much paper coming in. That's a benefit not only to the city to house and manhandle that paper, but to the applicants not having to reproduce and provide all that paper to us. So we are also proposing to change the number of copies once a final plat is approved all the way through the system and filed of record with the county. Currently, we require 3 paper copies and 1 Mylar. Mylar is pretty out of date now, so we're reducing the 3 paper copies to 1 and the Mylar to just a reproducible, some format that it can be reproduced from, and that may just be an electronic version of that filed copy. So those are the text amendment changes. The findings are identified in your report. As you can see them on the screen, I won't go through them, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have on this text amendment.
Just, in my opinion, Paul, I think you guys hit the nail on the head with everything that we discussed the last couple of meetings on not only input from the development community, but also, I think we were a little too restrictive on the 2 years. So I think this is a good in-between. I do like the triggers. I think that gives future planning commission, staff, whoever may be here 20 years down the road, something to go by. So I applaud y'all looking at that and putting it in.
Thank you.
In the triggers, the street system is not substantially altered and the layout is not substantially altered. Presumably that's going to be a bit open to interpretation, and there's not going to be any precedent to base it on, and will the city just decide case by case what is substantial or not?
We did talk about, do we put specifics in here? But what if the specific really doesn't make any sense in the overall design or layout or ability to serve with infrastructure? But what if another alteration in a different scenario does appear to need to come back to the Planning Commission as a preliminary plat? So we purposefully left it a little open and subject to interpretation, because we believe that just lining out, if you extend a street by 100 linear feet, wow, that might get 2 lots. Is that a major impact or not? If it's 2 lots out of 10, that's pretty significant impact. If it's 2 lots out of 500, that's not. So leaving that flexibility in there is what we chose to do.
Okay, thank you.
If there's a disagreement between the developer and the staff on what is substantial, that comes to the planning commission. If there's a disagreement and both parties want to, if you say it's substantial, the developer says it's not substantial, who is the party that decides?
That would be the Board of Adjustment.
Okay.
They are the authority under state statute to hear appeals to staff's determination of
So there is a
zoning
process for that, and that's great.
yes, there is. Any others for me? Okay.
Very much. I will open the public hearing. At this time, anyone wishing to speak in favor of this item, step forward, state your name and address for the record.
Roger Ghost again. I agree with Dusty. Paula hit it on the head with this one. She got, I think, everything we discussed. I would like consideration to be given in the the second sentence where the add-on, approval of a final plat must be obtained within 5 years, the 5-year period. I think it might cut down future discussion if that was for any section, which is sort of what the first one said. But if, somebody files a preliminary plat and they file a final plat for any section, I don't read that as being real clear. You guys might, if you disagree with me, that's great.
Where are you at, Roger?
Okay, 3, after approval.
Okay.
Okay, the additional language, second sentence. The first one says approval of preliminary plat is effective for a period of 5 years. Approval of a final plat must be obtained within the 5-year period. Approval of any subsequent final plats within the preliminary plat effective period shall validate. I just think it'd make it clearer if that second sentence said any section. The third sentence gets to it, but saying it twice might not hurt. That's it. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak in favor of this item? Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? This time I'll close the public hearing and ask for staff's alternatives.
Thank you. We actually suggest that you recommend approval. Whether you identify any changes or not, we think this is a positive move for the city. So you can recommend approval as presented, you can recommend approval with any identified changes as Mr. Gose indicated, or you can see that the amendment is not needed and not recommend that the city council approve it. Be happy to answer any other questions you have.
You have any
question?
problem with Roger's request there, Paula?
No, we can just adjust it to say approval of any final plat must be obtained within the initial 5-year,
Okay.
within the 5-year period. Yeah, any final plat for that subdivision. So that would be 1 or 2 or all.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
Roger, would that get it? Yeah. Okay.
Discussion.
Let me see, let me find the motion here. Find the proposed text amendment is needed and recommend the city council approve the proposed text amendment with the identified change. That's my motion.
I'll second that.
I'll vote. Motion passes 4-1. Next item for business is text amendment, Land Development Code Amendment PZ-17-2207, requesting review and approval of amendment, City of Stillwater Code, Chapter 23, Section 23-357, Water Distribution System.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, still affects platting and subdividing. This is proposed text amendment to Section 23-357 in the Land Development Code. That is the section, and it's included in your packet, that identifies the water distribution system and the requirements therein when subdividing land. Back in April, the City Council met for the final plat for North Tower Park, and this is after it had come through the Planning Commission for that design modification for water main extension. And that was not approved at the City Council due to a minimum water pressure issue. So the direction that staff received from the City Council is the reason we're before you this evening with a text amendment, to make it very clear and to apply that direction to the daily activities, and also to put the public on notice as to what that direction we received from the council is and how it will affect them. So, roundabout. The water distribution system, since it does discuss the requirements for extension of water mains, the ability, looping, the developer's responsibility, the city's responsibility, minimum size, et cetera, we felt that it was proper, based on the direction received from council, to clarify in this section of the code, and I will read off what the language says. The proposed language is, no new lots will be created after, and I plugged in June 20th of 2017. That is a placeholder date. It is subject to change depending on when we believe, if the council does proceed with an ordinance, when that ordinance would be effective. More realistically, it would be effective toward first or middle of August because of ordinance readings and tracking and publication. So, no new lots would be created after a certain date without access to water service meeting the minimum pressure requirements specified in the minimum operating pressures as described in the Stillwater standards. And that is where the minimum pressure of 40 PSI is established. a companion to this that you see in your language, but is not before the Planning Commission this evening, is the actual water service connections or a water meter, because this piece only covers the creation of lots, that prohibiting those creations that would not meet the minimum water pressure. Serving any lots from a system that does not meet the minimum operating water pressure is a companion piece. With any council action on the Chapter 41, as I have identified in this, it does not come through Planning Commission. It does not necessitate a lot of the public notice that any change to land development code is required under state statute. So I put it in here for y'all to see the companion piece. And our water resources director and our engineer are here if you have any questions on why it's important to also have this companion piece. We do have exemptions in here in the companion piece, as you will see. And the exemptions are any lots that are existing prior to whatever that magical date is when it's effective, would be authorized to have a single water service connection, and also lots in the area to be served by the Water 2040 project that is currently underway, that the city is responsible for, may also have a single water service connection, but that exception in the Water 2040 area would expire when Package A of that project is complete. And again, Water Resources staff are here to identify what that is. But I just wanted y'all to be aware, it's not just not creating lots, but it's the serving of any lots, with the exception of you can have a meter for an existing lot. Questions?
Okay, so.
Commissioner Lane looks a little,
And I read through this several times, so excuse my ignorance, but basically, it sounds to me like if you're in an area, let's take Tower Park, for example, the one we've seen come through several times. Or is this saying that they could not develop that piece of property? Is that what this is saying?
until they provide the minimum operating water pressure.
Is it part of the 2040 plan, or would that make any difference?
Would not make any difference. On existing lots, which piece are you talking about?
Okay, I guess I'm trying to mix in new lots with existing lots. I understand the exceptions are for lots that are already there.
Correct.
Prior to whatever August, whatever date that is.
Correct.
That's just for infill lots, existing lots.
That is correct.
Now, do those existing lots have to be filed of record and be a lot, or does this pertain to preliminary plats in process or final plats?
It would be a legally established lot, which would be a platted lot or a lot that is created by a meets and bounds description.
Okay.
So a preliminary plat does not create individual lots. It's to use the term loosely, a conceptual layout.
And also, does this basically keep them from wanting to do the private water lines like what they talked about doing in that section of Tower Park? Well, I guess it would, because they couldn't plat it to begin with.
Correct.
Okay. That's what I thought it said. Okay, thank you.
There could be some additional exceptions to this. For instance, if a piece of ground was more suitable to park or an outlot, non-buildable, and there was not the need to have water or a water service connection to that lot, then that could be another exception, but it's difficult at this point in time to identify every exception that could possibly lay out there. So we just scaled it back to identify the most common that we would be seeing is No new lots unless that 40 PSI is provided. No service connections or water meters unless 40 PSI is provided, unless you are an existing lot of record.
I understand, thank you.
Okay. Be happy to take any questions. A couple of findings, it does clarify the requirements for new lot creation, and it does allow continued division of land where those minimum water pressures are provided.
Okay. I'll open the public hearing, and anyone wishing to speak in favor of this item, step forward, state your name and address for the record.
Roger Ghost, 113 East 8th. I don't know where to start. I think we've got a standard that there's no justification for. Somebody reached up in the air and pulled 40 PSI out of it, and that's what we're going to do. Because even when I was city engineer, 40 years ago, we had the lousiest water design, and the city code said 12-inch, 10-inch, 8-inch, that's it. No design required. So we overreacted and went with 40 PSI. It's above the state minimum or state required for fire service. And to this day, there's no scientific justification come forward by staff for this requirement, and city can't meet it in a lot of areas. So what are you doing? You're driving development outside the city limits. And the Planning Commission needs to be aware of that and concerned about that, because those lots don't pay sales tax, they don't pay property tax to the city's nothing, they don't use city electricity. So that's a big issue, what's going on. The Mickey and Gary Rogers had us working on a preliminary plat under the water tower out at North Tower Park. Their process has been held hostage while staff runs this thing through. There's existing water lines through the property. We designed around them, and that water line's got 33 PSI in it, and the city code currently would allow them to tie onto that. They were told before they started spending a whole lot of money that they could tie onto it. We go to preliminary plat, and all of a sudden the brakes are put on, because we said what we saw happening on the other section to the south is, they got fully designed down there, and then the city said, no, you can't do it. They spent a lot of money. I feel that their development under the water tower is just being held hostage while the city speeds this thing through. Legally, there's nothing in the code that says they couldn't build those or plat those lots today and get water taps. But the city is holding it up until they can get this ordinance on the books to keep that from happening. I will tell you, we've been in considerable discussion with the city manager. There is a proposal by the Rogers to pay a prorated share for a pump to get that whole neighborhood up to 40 PSI. That whole neighborhood's got a problem. It's not just these proposed lots that are the whole neighborhood. And I'm sorry, but the 2040 plan addresses Southwest Stillwater, didn't take care of the rest of the folks in this town. So I don't know, if you're going to stay with the 40, this wording, development's just going to go out of town. Questions? Thank you.
Just so I can clarify, Roger, for the minutes, this was the section for speaking in favor of the proposal?
I took your comments as you're not in favor of this.
Not, thank you. Yes.
So I think we ought to clarify that in the minutes, that even though he came up under being in favor of it, he is not in favor of it.
Okay. Let those in the audience in favor speak. I'm sorry.
No, we just want to clarify our minutes.
Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak in favor of this? Anyone else wish to speak in opposition? Right. At this time, then, I'll close public hearing and ask for staff alternatives.
Okay, the alternatives before you this evening are to recommend approval to the city council, to recommend approval with any identified changes, just as the last text amendment, or not find that, or find that this amendment is not needed and therefore not recommend approval to the city council. And again, Water Resources is here to answer any questions that are outside of my scope.
Can Water Resources come up so I can ask them a question? And my question is, do you have a rationale for the 40 PSI? What is the rationale for the 40 PSI?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Bill Millis, Water Resources Director, and I did want to offer a couple clarifications just to help you understand things, and that was one of them. The first one about, if I could cover it before I forget it, and then I'll answer your question, was about the
problem.
development. This proposed text amendments, if that's what they're called, would apply outside the city too, on both the rural systems that the city owns. So it does not just apply on the municipal system, but on the former Rural Water District Number 1 and the former Rural Water Corp Number 3. So all our water systems would be held to the same 40 PSI standard. As far as the rationale, the 40 PSI was adopted in 2011 with the design and construction standards. And the main drivers, or the main driver was our experience with customers, just knowing that our customers were not satisfied with, 26 PSI or 30 PSI. Generally, anything below the 50s, we tend to get complaints. Some people are happy with it, some people aren't, but in general, we found that our customers are not happy with definitely below 40 PSI. And looking around for, so that it wasn't just a number pulled out of the air, the International Residential Code recommends between 40 and 80 PSI at the entry to the residence. And as you know, with the service line, there's going to be, or the potential at least, for more losses between the meter and the house. So 40 PSI wouldn't necessarily even meet that requirement, but it's pretty close. The 10 state standards, which are mostly in the Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, that area, so it's not any, it's not national, but it's a pretty widely accepted standard, and they recommend 60 to 80 PSI. And so those were, not hard and fast, not rules, but those were trying to balance the service that we believe our customers expect, with realizing the state of the system at that time, that we're working to bring it up, and that's a big driver behind Water 2040. It's a $50 million program to bring up water pressure in existing areas that does not meet the 40 PSI standard, as well as allowing for future development through the year 2040. Does that answer your question?
That answers my question. Thank you very much. That's what I needed.
Bill, what's the state standard or DEQ standard?
The 25 PSI is the DEQ standard. And that's part of what happened in the Water 2040 area, is even if it's 25 PSI when an area is developed, that can erode over time as the materials age of the service lines, as houses are added on to get more features, add water using features. As more development comes around the area, so a hill that may have had 25 PSI when it was first built out, then later won't. So some kind of called buffer is just, in general, is just going to be a good practice, because that 25 PSI definitely has the potential to deteriorate over time, or whatever the beginning pressure is when a neighborhood first develops.
And what are other prosperous cities in Oklahoma doing in terms of their standard that they require?
Oh, as far as their minimum, it's a good question, because we did, when the standards were adopted, we did compare to, I don't remember how many, half a dozen, 4, 5, 6 other cities in general, and I can't remember, I don't know, if you remember specifically? I don't recall. Yeah, we could research that, but I don't recall. I know we tried to make sure we weren't out of line with the norm in different cities, but I don't recall any specific numbers with regard to minimum pressure.
But do you recall, and you're not in a court of law, do you recall that you were in line with other cities?
As far as the standards were very broad. I mean, they covered,
Yeah.
because we had
But the
very
40
little noise.
PSI, is that-
The 40 PSI,
Did you find other cities that had numbers around that amount, or were most cities below that?
I couldn't even say. I just don't remember. I don't remember any cities, being at 60 or higher. I don't, but they could have been silent on it, which would mean that it would have been 25, and I just don't know. I'd be glad to research it, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Do we care what other cities have? Would we like to be as good as or better than?
I think the professionals have reviewed this and come up with 40 PSI, and what I heard from the rationale seems reasonable and normal. If I'd gone through it, I might have come up with a different number, but to me, I don't think that's the issue, whether it ought to be 35, 40, or 45. The issue is, do we go along with the idea that if it's already platted, even though they have less than 40 they can tie onto, but if it's not been platted yet, and I may not be using the exact legal terminology, but you can't go in there and subdivide it if you don't have that 40 PSI. Now, there is a way of getting that through pumps, but sometimes that can be fairly expensive.
Well, I'll just say I'm adamantly opposed to this. Main reason being, I feel like, and I'm not going against your professional, obviously you guys know more about water than I do, but I do know that it will discourage development within the city limits of Stillwater. I don't think that's all the developer's fault or the landowner's fault that our city can't provide 40 PSI, to, a standard that we've set upon ourselves, and we can't do that. Obviously, sure, I'm sure it's a lot more user-friendly than 25, but again, I'm adamantly against this. I don't like the 40 PSI to start with. That's my opinion, and again, I do have a tendency to agree with Roger. Maybe in what you said, Bill, it'll go with any of the water systems that Stillwater has, rural water, whatever, under our umbrella. But that doesn't keep development from going to Perkins or Perry or some.
Right, yeah, I didn't mean to suggest
No, and I
anything
understand.
different.
I just wanted to clarify that you
Sure.
did, that Roger had said it'll run it out of, out of the city limits. It could run it out of town as well.
Right.
And so, again, with the dire shortage of lots that we have in Stillwater city limits right now, I think this is just another knife to the heart of trying to get some development going within our city limits. So that's my opinion.
But I also think that if we don't provide it's a quality of life issue. I mean, if people turn their faucet on in their new house in Stillwater, and as people had talked about here a few years ago when we had these problems, that it's just a trickle, especially in the summer or when people are running things. That doesn't create, that house is there in Stillwater for the rest of its life. There's no way for us to make any mitigation at that point other than doing pumping and things like we're doing in the 2040 plan. Why not try to set something up front so people know when they plat, they gotta hit something before we go ahead and just sort of say, well, there's nothing we can do about this here. Sorry, guys, you got nothing. You're underneath the water tower and you got no water or very, very low water. So, I mean, so I understand where you're coming from, and I certainly don't want to cast any pall on development, but at the same time, we're not developing anything if you can't supply water to people at a pressure that they can take showers and things like that either. And for the citizens, I think they would feel like we're not doing what we should be doing if we're just letting brand-new houses be built where they can't supply water to a reasonable standard.
Well, I guess my point to that is the city, I think, has a responsibility in the main lines to have 40 PSI. I think that the line should have 40 PSI. That's not the developer's fault or the landowner's fault that we can't provide 40 PSI. And so that's the rub I have with it, Brian, personally.
Yeah. Any other questions for staff?
I have no more questions.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion if there's no more discussion. Okay. Find that the proposed text amendment is not needed and recommend that the city council not approve the proposed text amendment.
Is there a second? The motion dies for lack of second.
I'll make a motion, find the proposed text amendment is needed, and recommend the city council approve the proposed text amendment as presented.
Second. All right. I did. So I'll call for the vote then on that motion. The results of the motion passes 3-1. The next item for business is approval of meeting summary for the May 16th, 2017 meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second?
The motion passes 4-0. Our next Planning Commission meeting is June 20th, 2017. We have a motion for adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
The motion prevails 4-0.